internet. I'm glad to tell you we're back here at the book show. We've got Justin Taylor. We first met the man at the Savate days as well as Savate Battle. 3-2 Battalion member, signals officer. Had a fascinating career. He did what he could with the army. Wasn't sitting back somewhere being an half-cut or something. No, he volunteered. He went all the way. Also served with, I believe, 2 Recce when you did your camps. And you wrote a book. It's called A Whisper in the Reed. Now, we're going to put all the links for the book at the description as well as in the video, so don't worry about that. But I'm glad to have a fellow author with me. Justin, thank you. Thank you for your time. We appreciate it. We know you were a busy businessman, and you took the time to talk to us. Now, from Savate, I know that the name of the book, you've explained that to us, but perhaps you should do it again. There might be some people here who haven't seen the Savate shows. And if you haven't, please go and have a look. Fantastic stories, real combat stories about the men who've been there. Savate Day itself is so special. It's one of those days which you don't joke about. That's where they honor the ones who passed. So, Justin, over to you. Can you tell me, where did this idea of a book come from? And then I'll ask you about your military background.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Koos, very much for having me on the show again. Yeah, interesting thing with the book is I never set out to basically write a story, let alone publish it. How it came about, Piet Nokia was chatting to me in the 2010 Savate reunion, and in that conversation, we sort of talking through a whole lot of things, and realized that at the Battle of Savate, 5 HQ officers went into the battle. Only 2 of us survived the day, and that was the OC, Commandant Ferreira, and myself. He's since died of natural causes. And that's where Pete said, look, you're the only guy left alive who's was in the HQ, the Battle of Savate. So please, for history's sake, he's written a book specifically on Savate. So for history's sake, please write your account of that battle. And yeah, I wasn't particularly keen to do that. For me, it was like swallowing barbed wire, revisiting all of that. But he kept badgering me. And a couple of months later, he happened to say to me that Trompi, who was the lieutenant in charge of the platoon that defended the HQ that day, a couple of months after we'd met and had the discussion, he died. So when he said to me, listen, before you die, please write this story. So that's how it all started. And so I thought, well, he's got a point. And I wrote the Savate story for Piet Nokia. Decided to personalize it and pitch it to my audience, my daughters, as I wanted them to read it. And then with that in mind, I sort of put the start of how the training and all that, and how I got to 3-2 leading up to Savate, and then after Savate, and then eventually into my national service. So I basically put that basic story together, sent it through to Pete. He came and visited me a few months later. So what are you doing the story? I said, well, you wanted the history. The rest is for my daughters or whoever want to, who'd ever like to read the story. And he said, can I send it to my publishers in London, Binghelian? I said, no, you can't, because it's a very personal story. Anyway, eventually he persuaded me, and I went to Helion. And again, I sort of not fought against, but was very hesitant to go ahead and publish it because of the personal nature. And eventually I thought, well, if they think it's good enough to publish, I need to take whatever might come on the chin with this. And so, yeah, agreed and fleshed the story out a bit for them. And it was published in 2013. And it's been a very interesting journey, I must say, with the whole process. And so, yeah, so I was an unwilling publisher or author, but very grateful looking back that they pushed me to publish the book. I've since republished as an independent author. Yeah, and I just hope that people get something positive out of the story. That's the main thing for me, is to learn something from it.
Victor, of course, was also a 3-2 battalion member. Recce wing, I believe, wrote many good books. And we will invite him to the show at some stage. There's always an open invitation. I know that when you write a book, Justin, there's a part of your soul inside that book. I don't think people always realize that. So it takes a lot of guts actually to write a book, especially where there's a personal angle to it. But I also know it can do good for yourself, that you feel better afterwards. After you wrote the book, could you then say, okay, the devils is now, taken care of in that sense of the word?
Yes and no. I think the nice thing with the fact that Helion published it was once I'd sent it off to them, I took a back seat. I didn't do any book launches. I was very happy, take a back seat, let them do what they need to do. And so that was made it easier for me. And yeah, because the last thing with all of this that you want to creep into it is any sort of ego or any of that sort of stuff. But yeah, at the end of the day, the last thing for me with this is that if anybody wants to know about my military career, it's simple. I just say, well, read the book. I don't have to try and explain. And yeah, it has been, it's still, the emotions are still raw, always will be. But it has in some way made it a lot easier to deal with it and move on and see it in a better perspective, I suppose.
Well, I have to say that we've had fantastic commentary on the Savate Day battle, as well as on the day where you took part. But people are going to ask now about your military career. And yes, we expect you to go and buy the book and find out more. We can only talk about 30 minutes here, but 40 minutes. But tell us about your military career, Justin, because it's important. When I read a book, I always look at who's the author. I want to know, is this guy actually capable of telling me what he's telling me, especially a book like this? So you can just take us through how you ended up in the South African Army and what you did.
Yeah, looking back on those days when we grew up under the umbrella of apartheid, as it were. So as young white guys, we were all called up to the military in the from mid 70s through to the end of the 80s. So when I finished school, yeah, I called up for national service. And I can remember out of my classmates, I was the only guy who was really keen to go to the infantry. I wanted to be a platoon commander. And the rest of the guys were all trying to get into the sort of artillery and Air Force and Navy and that sort of stuff. And the irony is that they were all sent to infantry and I was sent to signals, which I was very disappointed about, I must say. But once I got there, I thought, let me make the most of this. So put my head down, got through basics, got onto the junior leadership course. Basics was 3 months. Junior leadership course was 6 months, and attended camp outside of Heidelberg on the Highveld, middle of winter, which was quite tough with the dry, cold conditions. And then it was 2 months officers course after that. So there was a training, and yeah, the training was very interesting. Luckily, I'd done a bit of research before I got to the army, and read a couple of books. So I understood what they were doing to us, especially with basic training, taking 30 guys, completely different walks of life, all individuals, and the process over millennia, I think, has been developed, and millions of guys have probably been through it. They break you down physically and emotionally. They're trying to get you down as low as they can, and then they build you up. And when they build you up, you come back up as a team and work together. And yeah, I think the most important thing I learned in basic training certainly was you either all come back, all 30 of you, or none of you come back. And so, yeah, molded us together as a very strong team. And that for me is the basic element, I think, of any good army, is that thought process, or yeah, you look out for each other. And then junior leadership, yeah, that was where the signals training started coming in. It was very basic and very, well, I say rudimentary, very theoretical, way too theoretical for me, as I discovered when I got to 3.2. It should have been a lot more practical. So, yeah, when I eventually arrived at 3.2, I was completely out of my depth, where I suddenly had to set all these radios up and went through a huge learning curve when I first got to 3.2. Yeah, and being signals, interesting thing in that 9 months that I was there, I think I fired 250 rounds through my R1. Again, disappointed with that. So I had to do some catch up when I got to the border with that. And just my comment, from being initially very disappointed about being posted to signals, the fact that I volunteered and got into a unit like 3.2 meant that I had a very interesting cerebral, is probably the best way I can describe it, experience as a 19-year-old second lieutenant. Because being the signals officer, I was in the HQ. I worked side by side with the officer commanding on a daily basis. So it was an amazing experience from that point of view. And also working with Commandant Ferreira. He was one of those guys who sort of gave you the parameters, left you to do it, everything, get on with it in between that. And yeah, so there's a lot of planning. I knew a lot about what was going on, as opposed to friends of mine who were platoon commanders or platoon sergeants, corporals. They had a very tunnel vision of what was going on. I had the bigger picture. So very unique experience being a signals officer in a combat unit like 3.2.
I always ask this question to you people, but did you have any idea what you were volunteering for when you first heard of 3.2 Battalion? I mean, it's a secretive crack infantry unit working behind enemy lines, not even in South African uniforms. They had like a camouflage uniform. I believe it came in 2 shades, one for winter and one for summer, and we're going to show you a mannequin on what it looked like. Perhaps I should ask you first, tell us about the mannequin before I forget, because I'm going to put a picture of it here for us.
I think I'll get to the mannequin, but yeah, that's that question of why did I volunteer for 3.2 Battalion. It was clear in my mind why I volunteered for the border. I'm not the spit and polish sort of guy. So special forces is more where I fit in, where the discipline is about your weaponry and your basic cleanliness, and getting on with the job, as opposed to the snappy salutes and yes sir, no sir sort of stuff. So, and being up in the border with the wilderness, the openness, the adventure up there. Grew up on a farm, so I would have died a death with a million screams if I'd been sent to a regular army unit in South Africa. So going to the border was clear, but 3.2, yeah, that's a question I've still not too clear in my mind, and it's an interesting one. And I ask all other guys in 3.2 and try and sort of profile them as to what was it that made all of us volunteer for 3.2. I knew very little about it other than black Portuguese-speaking ex-Angolan troops and clandestine missions. So it must have been, yeah, the intrigue, the adventure, but I just also instinctively knew that that's where my destiny lay and where I'd fit in because of the unconventional nature of the battalion. And yeah, so interesting. And then when I got there, it was just an amazing experience. But why? I knew very little, so why did I go to 3.2? Still a bit of a puzzle, but no regrets. So
Okay, we'll get to the mannequin, but now my lawyer mind is thinking that. Justin, if you did know a lot, would you still have volunteered?
absolutely. There's, yeah, no doubt. Absolutely no doubt in my mind. So I think also, the whole apartheid thing didn't sit too well with me. I didn't quite know what the solution was, other than it had to be something better than that, or it was fair, a lot fairer, can I say. Grew up on a farm, I spoke Zulu before I could speak English. So I suppose I was one of the more liberal white South Africans. And yeah, and 3-2 was just incredible. There was no racial segregation there. In fact, to the contrary, it wasn't about the color of the man's skin that counted. It was what you were capable of and what you had to contribute was what counted. And that was just mind-blowing, being part of that process and that unit within the whole era of apartheid and the racism and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, I think that's also why I probably just instinctively knew that it was a Gurkha style sort of unit, and I just thought I'd fit in there better. So yeah.
I should mention here to people, we who grew up in apartheid South Africa, it was very different. And I think deep down we knew something was wrong. The entire world said we were wrong, but we chose to believe our leaders. For myself, it's a funny thing. Later, when I left the police, I became an attorney after 5 years at university, then another year of articles, law school, and I ended up in a place which represented Mr. Mandela. And there I was sitting. And I'm from the apartheid police. I would have shot these people a few years ago. And the man once asked me, when did I first heard about him? And I have to say I was about 19 years old, 20 years old before I even heard about Mandela. That is how bad apartheid was. We cannot in any way condone it. And we will not. But when you came back, Justin, it must have been weird for you. I mean, yeah, you were fighting with these wonderful other soldiers. No skin color involved. You get back to South Africa, the States, as you people call it. And suddenly apartheid is back.
Yeah, I think that was very, very difficult. That part of it, there were a few aspects to getting back and dealing with it all. Firstly, I think the reality of what we went through and the combat stuff and friends that didn't make it, etc. The other issue, especially having been at 3-2, was the covert nature of the operations we did were all top secret, cross-border operations, so we couldn't talk about that. And then on top of that, coming out of 3-2, we had to deal with the whole racial issue getting back, and having been in a unit where that just wasn't the issue. So it was a lot to deal with, and difficult to deal with. So yeah, I think just, and the beautiful thing for me was there was 80 when I was in 3-2 Battalion, and 1994 with the democracy being born, so true democracy in South Africa. Yeah, that was the cherry on the cake for me. It was that made it all worthwhile, that it was now based on what is fair. So yeah, it was very difficult coming back into that scenario with the racism back then and having been in 3-2 Battalion.
There are some people, of course, who will say this is a confusing issue, because on the one hand, you're in the elite regiment in the apartheid army, as we overseas will call it. On the other hand, you're a liberal man. How did your brain sort this out? I'm curious to know.
Again, I mean, going to not a position, I look back. Yeah, getting called up to the army, being a liberal sort of guy, you know, why am I going? The end of the day, I was had to do my duty. My attitude and approach to it was I'd rather be part of the process and put something positive within that process, and my tiny little contribution to it all help it resolve itself somehow. So, and also, you know, the other big thing that they sort of made quite a big thing about was that we were fighting against communism, which, yes, we were. So that was made it a bit easier. But at the end of the day, I wanted to do my bit for my country, play a positive role, even within the negativity of that whole apartheid issue. So it was, yeah, it did make it interesting and a lot more complex. Once I got to 3-2, again, being in the HQ, I was able to listen to a lot of the sort of conversations between the senior, the brigadiers, that sort of colonels, brigadiers. And yeah, after a while I worked out that the way I interpreted their military strategy at the time was to keep the pressure off the country's borders to allow the political situation within the country to resolve itself. And that, once I'd worked that out, when I got to 3-2, it made it a lot easier for me. And that's where I believe our contribution in the military was very, very positive for the country as a whole.
I think that subsequent events has actually proven you correct here. I mean, when Mr. Mandela took over in 94, the country was functioning. Now, I'm not interested in what he's doing today. That's another subject I don't want to touch. But the fact is, the military did ensure that there were free and fair elections. The time was bought. The politicians saw that they act together. And South Africa had a good chance to become a great country. So I think there's truth in what you said. Now I have to ask you, Justin, these things, are they in your book? Is it possible to follow your mind? Or is it more like a historical story?
Yeah, I must say a lot of things don't maybe come out strong enough in my book, because it took me writing the story and it took me, yeah, in discussions like this to make a lot of things clearer in my mind. So basically, the story is a very personal story of how I grew up on a farm. My best mates when I was on the farm with 3 black guys, then 7, 8 years old, packed off to boarding school for 10 years. I spoke Zulu before I could speak English on the farm. Unfortunately, very limited vocab because it didn't grow much beyond an 8-year-old guy on a farm fishing and shooting and riding horses. Yeah, and I'll just take the reader through my background on the farm, growing up under the mantle of apartheid, getting drafted into the military, so to understand the context within which we ended up in the military. And then, yeah, just a very personal story, I think, with my training and 3-2, and try to be as honest as I could about how I felt and my emotions. Again, my audience were my 2 daughters. So in a way, laid bare my soul very often, which is what made me so apprehensive about publishing the story. But the bigger picture stuff, there is a bit of it in there, especially sort of, I suppose, towards the end, because I wanted, if someone reads the book, I wanted them to understand where we came from, how we got into the military, and where it all ended up. So I do talk about at the end the fact that it ended up with 1994 with the free and fair democratic elections, and which for me made it all that much more worthwhile. So yeah.
Yeah, let's be honest. The new government did not create re-education camps like happened in Vietnam. And the pensions which they were paying out is honored to this very day. I think sometimes people forget about those 2 aspects. Now I have to ask you, can you tell me a typical day at 32 Battalion?
Okay, that's quite a difficult question to answer because it depends which day you're going to choose and what you're doing. But if in the HQ in Rindu, yeah, that's where all the fascinating. It was always a hive of activity. The training base was, I think, is about 200-300 kilometers away to the east, down at Buffalo. But all the admin was done in Rindu, was channeled through Rindu. Their leave, the guys who gone AWOL, the marriages, the deaths, and that was always, you could hear this buzz. And obviously the ops room was there with its big maps, and everything was planned and coordinated through that ops room. And from my perspective with the signals, we obviously had the main signals room at the HQ there, with its big HF radios and dipole antennas for long distance communication. And we would communicate to the east to Buffalo and to the west to Amoni. Those were our fixed bases. And obviously, if there were any operations on the go, we would have HF comms from the HQ direct to the tactical HQ, wherever it was. And more often than not, I would be in the tactical HQ in the bush. So from day-to-day HQ, yeah, you live this sort of bit of a pampered life, I suppose, an officer's mess from my perspective, but very isolated from everybody else because of the clandestine nature of what we were doing, which fascinated them and made it very difficult from my point of view, because I had to be very careful what I said and didn't say, I suppose, which added to the intrigue. So that was in the HQ, and then, yeah, being in the TAC HQ, depending where that was either in an army tent in some other base somewhere to the west, more often than not, or if it was in Angola, we would dig a bunker and set it up in this bunker, sort of, which is 3 meters by 3 meters by 2 meters, 3 meters deep. Which always worried me. If we got mortared, which we did, I always made sure I wasn't in there because it was too big a hole. So yeah, and manning the radio, setting the HF up to communicate not only back to Rindu or maybe back to Sector HQ in Rindu or Oshakati or Ndangwa. And then, yeah, VHF was the short distance line of sight communication, and that was ground to ground between the platoons and ground to air between the platoons and the either the spotter, the Bosbok, which we used to call the Telstar, or the gunships, or the Pumas. So yeah, there's always a fascinating mix between HF comms and the VHF, and making sure that everything was working. Because at 19 years old, it was, for me, it gave me sleepless nights, that the responsibility that lay on my shoulders, that if there was a communications failure, a whole platoon could get wiped out. So I worked day and night to make sure that didn't happen. Well, it did when I first arrived, and nearly got thrown out because of a comms failure. But then, yeah, I learned pretty quickly after that. So
perhaps we can now get to your mannequin, because that will, I think, describe visually to the viewer here, that how you people operated, because you were not just sitting there in a air-conditioned bunker. I mean, you people actually went out on operations.
yeah, I think that, for me, the exciting part of it as a youngster, and probably why most of us were in 3-2 for the adventure, was when we did the cross-border operations. We would wear a different uniform. The Army Nutria or Browns was a regular South African combat outfit sort of thing, with leather boots, ankle boots. Whereas 3.2, we had different boots. They had canvas sides to them, which made them a lot more flexible. They had a soft rubber sole, nice and thick with no markings underneath, so it didn't leave a tread. Very comfortable, but very distinct and very much ops boots were, I mean, 3.2 was the only battalion that had them. So it was a real honor for me to wear that, let alone the beret. But yeah, going across the border, we would have those boots. We would wear camouflage combat fatigues. We would carry what we used to call a mochila, as a Portuguese name for rucksack. And that we were the first in the SA Army to, other than maybe special forces, to use A-frame rucksacks. And again, very distinctive, very unique to 3.2. We wore these funny, very impractical to me, Portuguese army style caps. Whenever we went into the bush, we used to put black is beautiful on our face or any area that was exposed in our hands, because without that, we would stick out amongst the black troops like a sore thumb. And again, going across part of, I suppose, the exciting part of it and the intrigue, no ID. Nothing that we carried could be traced to South Africa. I mean, to the point that you had a choice as to what weapon you could take, an AK-47 or an R1 FN. And if you carried an R1 FN 7.62, which is my choice, the ammunition at the back of the cartridge was blank. Whereas normally when you look at a rifle bullet, you can see at the back, it's stamped with the caliber, and you can also see where it was made, South Africa, wherever, East Germany, Russia, whereas ours was blank. So very different. And where the idea of the mannequin came up, a year or so ago, I was packing up my stuff out of a warehouse or whatever, and got to the army stuff, and I was pulling everything out of the balsack or the trommel or whatever, and suddenly realized that everything amongst the pile at my feet was everything that I happened to have been wearing at the Battle of Savate. And so I put it all to one side, labeled it, put it into an ammo box, so that my daughters one day, when they get to clear everything out after my eventual demise, they would realize. But then I thought, they won't really realize the full impact of all of this, because they won't know how it all fitted together. And that's where the idea of the mannequin came about. So I sourced one of those, had to rework the arms, fiberglass and foam, that thing, so that it could hold an R1. I found a fiberglass R1. And yeah, so head to toe, everything on that mannequin is exactly what I was wearing at Savate. The cap, the mochila being the rucksack, the chest webbing, the shirt with the bullet holes here on the side, the trousers, down to the boots. And it was an interesting process going through putting that mannequin together. So who knows where it's going to end up, but yeah, I think it would be nice on this to put all the photos of the different parts of the mannequin, and with an explanation, because it was classic 1980s style 3.2 cross-border operation kit that we were wearing. So yeah.
Well, I'm glad to say to the viewers here that Justin said to me just before we started that he will speak to us like Rick Lop and the others more detail, because this episode is about the book. So we have to get back to the book. The name of the book is quite fascinating. I wonder if you can tell us, how did you get to that name?
Yeah, somewhere, I'd sort of, somewhere along growing up on the farm, I'd heard of a poem or something that had been written, similar sort of title, Whisper in the Reeds, and that had always stuck in my mind. So once I'd written the book, I mean, when I started out, the first, I call it a bit corny, a Signals Officers' War or something like that. But once I'd read it, no, I'd written it, that idea of a whisper in the reeds became more and more prevalent in my mind because of the fact that 3-2 is no more. And I can remember one of the key things sitting in those moments that when you're reflecting and up there was on the banks of the Kavanga River, which was not only down south at Buffalo, this magnificent, beautiful river, massive river with these reed beds on the side. And it ran all the way up, going north, right up into Angola and past Savate. So a lot of my whole story and experience was around that river, and I spent a lot of time sitting next to it, looking out over the river. And so the reed beds and the wind moving through the reed beds, I can remember, it struck me often. I used to see that, and it was magical. You know, the reeds were standing there, sort of silvery, either in the sunlight or in the moonlight, and you'd suddenly see part of them starting to move, as if they were alive, or there was something out there. And it was that link for me when I think back on 3-2 and the experience, and the fact that it's no longer it was disbanded. Yeah, those wide open spaces. Whenever I see the reed beds, immediately I think, I look out there, and it's almost as if I can feel that something's out there with that link to 3-2.
Yes, we are recording General Kritzinger tomorrow. And he was one of the officers we had the state duty to go and tell 3-2 Battalion that they've been disbanded, I think in '93. And I'm sure he will tell us exactly what happened at the higher level. I hope he will. This was a political decision by Xavier de Klerk. Whether it's right or wrong, we can argue about that. But let me ask you, Justin, here where we're at the end of this episode, how did you end up into Reconnaissance Regiment, which I believe is the citizen force of the Recce? Am I correct to say it like that?
Yeah, I volunteered for that, and have initially been posted in the TEL command, and I probably did 5 or 6 camps, and a couple of those were training camps, doing up at Fort Dorpies in the Caprivi, which was very interesting. Special Forces, platoon weapons, that sort of thing. And then from there, most of the other camps, I was assigned to 5 reconnaissance at the Air Force Base on Dangwa, Ashukati. I can never always get confused which is the Air Force Base and the Army Base. And I think the base there was Fort Rev or Fort Foot. And that was fascinating because it was our sort of version of Sulu Scouts. And I remember the first time I went there, every Friday morning was a parade. And of 90 of us there were probably 6 or 8 guys, white guys, the rest black guys. And I suddenly looked down the row and realized that the rest of these guys were ex-guerrillas that I was standing with, and which is quite unique. So yeah, my experiences with 2 Recce, nothing out of the ordinary combat-wise. Some take HQs with 5 Recce, and very based in their base up in Ondangwa, Shikari. But yeah, very interesting. Getting to know and meet the Special Forces guys, very different breed of people, and fascinating to see the different, like the 1 Recce guys, how different they were to the 4 Recce Seaborn and the 5 Recce guys. Quite a difference amongst them. But I think the hardest, yeah, hardest thing to deal with there was seeing the impact of the war on these guys. And obviously there was that, I went through that to 3-2 as well. But seeing these guys, super talented guys, and a lot of them couldn't never really adapt back into normal civilian life, and which was hard to see and watch and see that play itself out. But yeah, but fascinating, a good experience to have been part of Special Forces. But yeah, no spectacular opses with them. Yeah.
Yet, you know, a signal officer, what you said just previously is actually true. You know the bigger picture because you talk to the commanders, you hear what happens everywhere via your radios. You're actually in a perfect position to know what was going on.
Yes, absolutely. But fascinating. A lot of the time, there was a lot that I knew I didn't know, which used to irritate me a bit. And it was fascinating how they handled that, because it was all need to know. I mean, I didn't need to know a lot of the really sensitive stuff. And one of my best friends there, Tim Patrick, Lieutenant Tim Patrick, who was killed at Savate, he was one of the intelligence officers. And even though we were such good mates, he never shared anything with me unless I really needed to know. But yeah, as a youngster, 19 years old, being at that level, it was an amazing experience. And very unique experience as a signals officer, to be privy to the bigger picture in the battalion, and even a bit above as well, and seeing these guys, listening to them talk amongst each other, very obviously guarded when we were around. The real stuff was behind closed doors or in private, but yeah, so.
Well, internet, we're coming to the end of this, of a book legacy, legacy book part of Justin. There's definitely going to be other interviews with him. I'm really grateful for that. It is, as he said in the beginning, I believe, if you want to know more, go and read the book. And I understand the book is available. We'll put the links out for you. It will be here. As far as I know, this is a fantastic book to read, a really good story. Justin, thank you. If you have any last words here for us, perhaps I should ask you, how did your daughters receive a book read?
Yeah, very emotional, I think, from their side, and it helped them understand what made me tick. That was the biggest benefit for them. Yeah, very meaningful for them. But just if I may, a last thing, you mentioned we did a lot of things wrong. And absolutely, we did back in the day. But I would like to stress that I believe we did a lot of things very right. And we all have a lot to be proud of, and a lot, and we need to focus on that, the positive things that we contributed at the end of the day.